I think a lot of people moved towards the RMM name because there was less evilness associated with the word RMM versus rat, but they're the same thing.
I'm going to go ahead and kick stuff off. My name's Phil, and welcome to this edition of Security Operations Weekly. I am joined today by my good friend and colleague, Jason Killam. Welcome, Jason. Glad to have you on board here. And today we are going to be talking about remote management and monitoring tools. Or did I get the M&M backwards?
I
What's
think
the
that's correct.
consensus?
Remote managing and monitoring, I
All
think.
right. We'll run with that. I had a 50% chance of getting it right, so at least if somebody else can corroborate it, hopefully that's good. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And this extraordinarily fast animation is a very appropriate one because this is a tough challenge. There's so many of these tools as we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about what RMM tools are, and a little bit of attacker methodologies and how they're taking advantage of them to kind of ruin our day or days as the case might be. And we'll also talk a little bit on some detection opportunities and just kind of weave those in there. But once again, if you have questions as we are going through this, please by all means drop them into the chat. I have that open here. This is usually about a half an hour, give or take. And if there are a lot of great questions toward the end, which we typically see, we may bleed a little bit over that 30-minute mark, but we will do our best to hit that for you. That all said, without any further delay, I am going to turn this over to you, Jason, to kick us off and kind of let us know what are RMM tools and why are they a concern to us in the defensive space?
Right. Well, okay. So RMM tools are, well, the name says, remote managing and monitoring. Most people, if you're in the older security sense, people have called things a rat, remote access tool or a remote access Trojan. I think a lot of people moved towards the RMM name because there was less evilness associated with the word RMM versus rat, but they're the same thing. But generally, it's a piece of software that gets installed that lets you remotely control a computer. Like most people think of like AnyDesk or LogMeIn, and or some of those other pieces of software, but there's tons of other ones. I think when I've looked at LOL the site, uh, there's like they have like 300 on there. Um, but it gives you an easy way to just basically tell the user, hey, install this for a help desk and a and threat actor. It gives them a way, hey, here, just run this real quick for me, and then I'll remote access your computer to do your support. Or if it's under some malicious premise, run this invite to a party, and they'll see the user probably might see nothing happen, and then the actor has remote access into the box they want to do whatever they want with. Yeah, like there a lot of times the premises for these are like party invites is a weird one I see a lot of. Some of them are tax forms, social security, uh benefits pages and some other weird stuff like that.
The greatest
And
hits, the
then
ones that
yeah,
have the maximum chance of succeeding.
yeah, and then there's yeah, it does seem to be a common theme across these is these greatest hits things you think of like the party invites is not something I saw until I started seeing these remote access tools being installed, which is I thought was funny. Is like I've never heard of this as a premise to try and invite somebody to a party and it's just a remote access tool. But all those the greatest hits also never die as well. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, then after that, there's usually something else they'll install. After the remote access tool, they'll install another remote access tool, or they'll install something like a rat, an actual malicious malware rat versus a remote access tool rat. Um, or yeah, we've seen some instances where it just deploys ransom. They start deploying ransomware and they start using these RMMs to kind of pivot around.
Yeah, well, and for me anyway, and we've seen this come in so many different flavors and different ways. I think like the two biggest takeaways for me are that these are legitimate tools.
Yeah.
They're designed for minimizing the friction between somebody who needs help and getting someone help. So, a lot of actual help desks in environment or enterprises, in enterprise environments will use these legitimately. I know that I use some variation of this with family members when they're having issues. Just had one of those pop up this morning about 10 minutes before this show kicked off. So I was like, I got to get on the air. We'll deal with this one later. But yeah, so there's so many of them. They are legitimate. That really kind of makes things challenging for identifying or detecting them. Um, and then here's some other aspects to that too. And because they are legitimate, it's an actual legitimate company that's putting these out. So they're signed. So if you
Yep.
think, oh, well, I'm looking for only running signed binaries in my enterprise environment, don't get me wrong, that's great. But this is a possible weakness in that in relying solely on that means of detecting it. Signed doesn't always mean legit. And then again, like you said, the what was the site, lolrmm
Well,
io,
yeah.
which Chris
Yep.
put in there. Hundreds and hundreds of these that are out there, and probably more every day. And hey, let's even face it, we're using one right now. Zoom itself can be seen as a remote management and monitoring tool because you can get remote control of the system to perform a remote assist or something like that. Um, the anything else you wanted to add on challenges? I know we touched a little bit on this on the last slide. Anything you wanted to add on the challenge for defenders here?
Yeah. So one of the things like I noticed one particular customer we had, they had like they kept having Screen Connect come up in their environment, like malicious Screen Connect. I'm like, why did they have such a problem with this? Why didn't they just block it? And like then I started looking into like I was looking into one that was bad instance of Screen Connect, and all I can do sometimes all I need to do is just search what wrote Screen Connect, what wrote this installer for Screen Connect to disk, and then I can trace that back to the initial software install. But I kept running across their legitimate instance of Screen Connect when I was looking for the malicious one, and it's pretty hard to tell the two apart sometimes if they're both on the box. And so you have to cut the sometimes it's almost impossible. Some of these remote access tools, they'll just write like an API key file or some kind of they'll just write like a configuration file to disk and they'll read from that to tell them who to talk to. And sometimes that remote endpoint that they're controlling from is not like a malicious domain. Sometimes it's just um, like I think LogMeIn is a good example. Uh, it just talks to logmein.com or whatever the domain is that it's used for normal support. So you can't it's hard to distinguish the two a lot of the times. And the other thing that I've always found is really difficult is like I said with trying to walk back that where this uh bad installer come from is you a lot of the times they're installed with a tool on Windows called MSI exec. So
Yeah.
when you run an MSI, a thing that people don't realize when you think about these an MSI is it has to install itself. And so the user runs it, and then the Windows says, this user's an admin. All right, he can install this software. It moves that install to a system process user under MSI exec, and then the install stuff starts happening where it writes the Screen Connect binary or whatever remote access tool to disk to program files, and then it starts talking back. So there's like this separation of a process tree, which is something we often follow up at my job as a detection engineer, as I open an event and I follow that process tree back. But that gets broken when you use an MSI.
Yeah, and it certainly speaks to some of the challenges of just generally chasing malicious activity across
Yeah,
processes in general, is that if they don't have that direct parent-child relationship, you're kind of left with a little bit of speculation, and you've got to take those what I like to call investigative leaps of faith and say, well, I've seen, Screen Connect or Log Me In or whatever, and I think I remember it doing this before, and knowing that the MSI exact pathway is a common one to be able to like, all right, well, I think I'm looking at an RMM. Let me jump across to that.
yep,
So lots and lots of challenges. You've done a whole lot of work in tracking these. So give us a little bit
yep,
of kind of a laydown of like, we'd be here for 3 hours if we had you list every single one. So we're not going to do
yep,
that.
right.
But give us kind of a brief rundown on some of the RMM work that you've done so far.
So like I think about it was either last year or the year before. I don't remember. We had a couple missed instances, and I realized I need to like focus in on this. And so I over the past like year and a half year, I just kind of like kept making detection rules for remote access RMMs. Like for Screen Connect, it's I figured out it's really suspicious when it talks to a very uncommon top level domain like Screen Connect shouldn't generally be talking to a .top domain. And I realized also that in the command line is the domain that it's going to talk to. So like some of the work I did was just trying to figure out where when it's malicious versus when it's normal, the differences between the two. And sometimes I'll just detect when it's normal. So I know, hey, you have this remote access tool in your box, and we'll tell the customer, and they may just turn that detect they can turn those kind of detection rules off, and those help me to know, hey, I can also look for this endpoint has this remote access tool on it, and no other box there's no other previous instance of this customer using this remote access tool. I can then like pivot into that and say, is this a legit instance or is this a malicious one? And then uh yeah, like I said, I can look for that. The initial installer sometimes is has like metadata about it that tells you, hey, this is an installer for LogMeIn resolve, and, but the binary name is maybe partyinvite.exe. So that's a pretty easy way to look for things is look at the metadata versus what the actual
Yeah.
like file name is.
Well, and you bring up a
Um,
great point. Actually, it
yeah,
speaks to a question that John asked in the chat here too. So I think it's a perfect point if you let me bump in on you.
yeah,
Detection of a lot of these things isn't going to be based strictly on signatures or um, uh, um, uh, fingerprints, hash values or such. You really have
right,
to go behavioral. And you mentioned a couple of great ones, like, okay, what was the command line that was used to execute this? And is it a domain? And now we're transitioning from endpoint to network domains. Is that domain something that's uncommon? Another really good one is just environmental. If your enterprise has a policy that we use, and I'm just picking names out of a hat here, we use Screen Connect for all of our remote assist. So our help desk, that's the legit thing. So maybe your detection logic needs to be tuned down just a little bit so it doesn't alert on that specific title, but
right,
anything else shows up in the environment, maybe that becomes more immediately suspicious. And that certainly speaks to having a good baseline of expected activity in the environment. And that crosses the network, it crosses the endpoint, it crosses all of those for sure. And it isn't, well, I don't know. Let me ask this as a question. I'm interested in your perspective on this, Jason.
yeah.
Um, do you think that it is feasible to have a purely technical detection mechanism, or is there always going to be a behavioral kind of human overlay that's going to be necessary, at least in the foreseeable future, to identify these?
Uh, yeah, I guess sometimes you have to put I
Sorry, I threw a
uh
new question in the mix at you. I'm
yeah, I
sorry
was
about
really
that.
I guess you have to kind of think about, does this make sense for this user to be like installing Screen Connect, I guess. I guess that's, and then but there are
Yeah.
some technical things you can do to say, if you see screenconnect.exe running, you don't use it, block it. But maybe for your another environment, you're like, we use this legitimately, don't block it. And then maybe you have to make some detection rules that get more in depth for Screen Connect if you use it legitimately. Actually, I've we tried just making Screen Connect detections, looking for screenconnect.exe for our side of things, but there's so many customers that use it. We had to we had to do a thing where we basically make a fire once for any instance versus just firing anytime Screen Connect runs, because a lot of Electron binaries, a lot of things in Windows, sometimes it'll fire a trial process of itself. And so we have to kind of like that causes a lot of data to come our way, and like we have to cut down that fire hose of data, and that gets really hard sometimes for making detection rules.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and
Hopefully that
I
answers your question. I'm not I'm not sure if
well,
I got the gist of
yeah,
it.
I think you did. And
Okay.
my mindset going into it was that purely technical signature, fingerprint type detection is probably going to require, like you said, okay, is it normal for this user to do this thing? Is
Yeah.
this title something that's supposed to exist in this environment versus a different one? So I think it's a really good use case for how, because these are legitimate tools, we can't simply say if the tool exists, fire an alert, because that can get extraordinarily noisy, lots of false positives, lots of wasted
Yeah.
time, effort on our part, and but it's also where you don't want to just ignore it because it has the strong potential and the demonstrated likelihood that adversaries are going to use that going forward for sure.
Yeah.
So it's not hopeless. There is detection, right? So we mentioned all RMM, and I can never say that fast. It's absolutely impossible for my brain to process that into words. Um, Very similar to what we had talked about the other week with a lot of our other law things, whether it's binaries and scripts, whatever your preferred acronym for the law things are. This is specifically catered toward RMMs, and gives you at least a starting point. And is that something that like is that what you had seen success in using as a jumping off point to augment with some of the behavioral or to whittle
Yeah.
down your millions to hundreds of events of interest?
Yeah, sometimes I'll have somebody in another Intel Slack mention some remote access tool being used. And so I'll oftentimes start with lol RMM as like my starting point for like what is the how do I detect this behavior normally for lol for this RMM? Um, so I'll pull up their page and it'll give me like the no the domains it normally talks to, the process names it usually uses, and so a lot of stuff that helps me get that starting point to get that initial starting point for a detection rule out the door, and then I can tune it from there if I need to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And when we were putting these slides together, I'll be honest, the ransomware tool matrix, that was actually a new resource to me that I didn't have a chance to dig into until I really started prepping for this show. That's actually a really, really interesting approach
yeah.
because it it seems to take specific threat actor groupings, activity clusters, and identify what their TTPs are. Can you talk a little bit to how that might factor into a detection strategy?
Yeah, so one of the things I kind of did when I was trying to figure out where I need detection gaps were for us was I pulled up the the ransomware matrix, and I'm like, okay, like on the screenshot here, AnyDesk is used by like I don't know how many there are, like 20 actors, whereas like Action One it has two, or Amy Admin has like one. So I'm probably going to prioritize any desk detection over Action One because I'm like, okay, I have maybe some really simple detections for Action One, but I maybe want to have some more in-depth detection coverage for any desk, or I might want some better coverage for Atera because I see there's a whole bunch there. So it kind of gave me this like heat map of where things were being abused. Because like I said, LOL RMM has like 300 different RMMs on it. I don't, I'm one person, so it's hard for me to make 300 detection rules for every single way each one of these RMMs can be used maliciously. This gave me like a point of reference of like, this has been used for bad. We should probably make detection rules for it before we make something for like on the LOL RMM, sorry, access remote PC as a example I can just see on the screenshot there.
Yeah, for sure. And like that's I think a really interesting approach because now you're layering on, well, let me rephrase that. Now you have the
Context.
opportunity to layer on threat intelligence and your known conditions where, and I'm completely making these numbers up. Do not attribute, this is not an attribution statement here. Let's say that I know that Lockbit specifically targets a certain industry sector or more commonly targets a certain industry sector. If I am in that sector, I might prioritize that one, even though there are only a few groups that use it because I know that
Right.
I'm in their target space. And if I'm not, maybe I further deprioritize and shift my attention elsewhere. So like knowing the landscape of these threat actors and the kinds of industry sectors that they target, that can also be a huge, huge multiplier that you put into your equation on what to prioritize for sure.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, that it helps a lot when I'm trying to like just distill it down to where my focus should be as opposed to just going after everything. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead here. This is another good one. Brad's actually a former student of mine, guy that I've gotten to know a while back. So I'm a huge fan of malware traffic analysis.net, but I am very interested to hear your perspective on using this for some of the detection opportunities as well.
he posts stuff regularly to his site. I think I've been using him his site since like, oh God, like 2015. Maybe it was like when I first started perusing it and like looking through like different malware traffic PCAPs. Uh, but he also sometimes will also share stuff on Blue Sky and some other places where like he'll talk about it, some piece of some executable installing log. I think one of the ones I when I first heard about LogMeIn and Resolve being used for remote access was through like a Blue Sky post of his. Um, and it's really helpful because now you have an actual PCAP to work off of actual malicious data. So if you're like me when I was at my old SOC, you don't see evil every day. So you have these examples of actual evil you can work off of that kind of give you the indicators as another starting point of the malicious side of things, what that traffic looks like. So in the example here as Smart 8 SG delivering net support rat, I can now know what net support rat traffic looks like, what user agents it uses, and what domains this instance is talking to. And then I can maybe compare that to if I use net support, what does that look like in my environment versus what this malicious traffic looks like? Or if I don't use net support, now I have some easy IOCs as well. And if I do have net support, yeah, yeah. So like you can compare things with things nicely when I have this malicious data set to work off of.
Yeah, and it's this really we're talking specifically about RMMs here, obviously, but this site has a tremendous library of all kinds of evil, and exactly what you just described, I think, is a wonderful use case where, well, I didn't see thing, whatever it might be, in this case, the net support rat delivered by this
Yeah,
mechanism. I've never seen it myself, at least maybe I don't know what I'm looking for, but I don't have any of my own collections and samples to use. You can go to this independent one, and Brad provides it in a lot of times with really good write-ups and everything. So super helpful. And then you can also use these at least for testing network indicators. Because you can take that PCAP, you can run it by your Yara or a
Durkheim.
Suricata rule or just a raw packet search if you're putting it into something like Archemy. Like all of those become great ways for you to validate your tool chain as well. And then you've got this real world sample that you can have a high degree of assurance actually represents evil and kind of validate everything from there. So excellent resource
Yep.
there. And just in general, I would say any site like this that becomes a known, good, trusted source of a library of evil, those can all be used in very similar ways. So good call out there for sure.
Yep.
Social media stuff. What else can we do in terms of some places to keep an eye on? I know you mentioned Blue Sky with a couple of the different sources, and we'll include the links to each of these in the write-ups. Anything else that you want to call out as good resources to kind of keep tabs on for this kind of stuff?
Uh, Maybe not specific social accounts. One thing I was thinking about is sometimes you look for those keywords. So like when I was looking for good places that post stuff about remote access tools, I found the that Blue Sky link for Bajari, and he had a talk at a conference about RMM abuse and stuff like that at that point in time. And Abuse CH is also a really good source. They're also a really good site that actually categorizes a lot of good IOCs through ThreatFox and URL House. Yeah, that when they're one thing that was interesting with this one was they were talking about this remote access tool that was actually not even a remote access tool in a legitimate sense. It was something called Trust Connect. And when I think Proofpoint looked into this one, they published a blog about it, and they were asking for base like Bitcoin as payment. And the actual people they were taking payment from weren't legitimate software people. They were just people installing rat. They're using it as a rat. So like there's this blending of like malware rats and remote access tools, and now they're also trying to basically pretend to be each other so that they can. Well, the remote access tools aren't trying to pretend to be rats, but there's the rat is trying to pretend to be legitimate to give it that air of this is a legitimate piece of software. We should allow it in our environment or whatever. Um, a lot of the like I said, mentioned malware traffic. He has his own Blue Sky, and I think he has a Mastodon. Huntress is another good source I've seen. They publish a lot of really good stuff about remote access tools. Proofpoint. us. We pub and Zscaler and our Red Canary blog has some good blogs like my own about remote access tools. Um,
Yeah, Chris linked
yeah,
that up at the top of the chat. And Chris,
yeah,
just if you could post that back in again for anybody that joined in after, because that's just a really good one that I know you both worked a ton on. So
yeah. And I tried to make it. It's really hard. That one of the things I keep running across when people talk about remote access tools is it's almost like a snapshot at a point in time of that of how things are being abused. And the thing is that's really hard to like get across is like they'll pick an RMM and stick with it until people start to make detection rules for it, and then they'll move to the next one. And so you have to kind of follow it as it happens, and that's really hard. So like these social media stuff like Abuse CH and some of these places kind of are an easy way to track that for people that aren't watching things as closely as I am or don't have as many resources available to them. You can just kind of watch these people, and then they'll kind of point you to where you need to be watching.
yeah, totally. And then just like this is a great case of where just continuing to slowly build a good list of reputed resources is going to build your feed of information, become something that you curate for your own purposes, stuff that you
Yeah.
find to be most useful and actionable for your environments. So all of that is great resources to use. Where's my click here? There we go. Some approaches to take. So, all right, you found an RMM tool and you haven't yet really figured out, is this good? Is this bad? What are some approaches you can take to kind of maximize the next couple of minutes to hour of your investigative workflow?
So, like I kind of on the slide here, if you find one, you're probably going to find another. I think there was an instance for a customer where there was like an actual ransomware actor, and they put four different remote access tools in the same box. So if you find one, they're usually going to install another. Oftentimes, that other one is going to be Screen Connect. Uh, I think they seem to prefer Screen Connect because they got used to using it a while ago and they kind of just stayed on it and there's some other aspects to it that let them use it effectively, I think, but I don't know the back end, the bad guy side of things and why they prefer it exactly. But oftentimes I'll see one new remote access tool kind of pop up, and then they'll just immediately turn around and install Screen Connect. So it's a really easy thing to watch for Screen Connect as a simple choke point, I find, for detection rules.
Interesting.
Uh,
Their old habits die hard as well. So,
Yeah, I'm not sure why they stick with it. It's interesting that they have stuck with it so hard, but it's just something to keep an eye on.
well, I think we appreciate that they did, right?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Uh, and then yeah, we talk about the tactics. Like I said, kind of the remote access tool will change, but the tactics kind of stay the same. Like a lot of times they're just taking an installer, renaming it. They're running the domain. They're like Screen Connect. Most of the time, the bad domains are newly registered. So you can kind of look for those suspicious domains like a .top domain or a domain that was registered yesterday, or just a regular .com domain that was registered yesterday. I think the furthest out I've seen bad domains registered is maybe like 6 months. So having those, a lot of times at my old job, the thing that would save us was our web filter was blocking stuff for newly registered websites. And I think that's a really good way to like block stuff and kind of
Yeah.
keep yourself protected. And
Yeah,
then, like I
totally.
said,
And
okay,
defense in depth, same thing as detection in depth, right?
yep,
Having multiple different ways of saying, maybe there's 10 different behaviors and each one gives you just a little bit more concern about the event overall, but you stack them all together and it becomes a
right.
consolidated
You
concern for
layer
sure.
things, yeah. So then you know everything.
Yeah. Awesome. 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 Well, Jared shared a great link in here, and I have not seen, actually, I may have seen that. I can't remember. I brought it up in a background window so I can check it out after.
Yeah.
Really good stuff overall. Hopefully, those who attended and were able to stick around, I hope you were able to find some value in this and kind of maybe think about how you would operationalize some of these approaches. Lots of great resources shared here. I want to say first, thanks very much, Jason, for joining in and sharing your perspective with us. It's always a blast to hang out and get your insights. And you all who have attended here will also get an email later in the week that'll include a lot of these resources and some other information. So after this kind of percolates into your brain cells a little bit, you think of how you might turn this into those detection opportunities in your own environments. I hope that you're able to layer on top all of the other with resources that we're going to provide you later in the week. Next week, we've got a very special event here on Security Operations Weekly. We will be working with our very good friend Tim Medine, who we, with all deference and appreciation, refer to as the godfather of Kerber roasting. And Tim's going to be on talking about why Kerber roasting is still a thing years after its original identification, how it's changing. He's got some really good insight into how deprecation of certain cryptographic ciphers is going to make it harder, but not impossible to achieve Kerber roasting, and privilege escalation in a domain environment in general. So, really good stuff coming up. Until then, thanks again, Jason. Appreciate your time.
All right. Yep.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. Cheers.